Welcome to Relevant Christianity. This is James W. Farris. Looking forward to sharing with you something that hopefully will help us to have a deeper appreciation for God's Word. As I said in the last or previous discussion, this is not an anti-Old Testament blog, although we are talking about relevant Christianity. There's a necessity on our part as good students not only to understand God's Word in the Old Testament, but also to apply the principles that we find in the Old Testament to our lives today. And that's what I wanted to begin with today. I want to give you a kind of overview regarding the application and awareness of the social environment of the days of Daniel, to kind of help us to understand some of the things that were literally going on for the Jewish people in that day and time. So that's what we're going to do in today's session. Now, understanding this, the book of Daniel is much, much more than Daniel in the lion's den, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. When I was a child, my mother and dad taught me those stories. The problem is when our Christian lives as adults do not mature beyond the concepts of simple childhood ideas. Now, in other words, yes, we should maintain a childhood faith, a childlike faith all the time, but we also need to dig deeper and appreciate the book of Daniel for more than just a couple of historical situations there. So the book of Daniel, as far as a written work, was something that inspired Jews as well as Christians today, because what we're learning is lessons about faithfulness and how you maintain spiritual propriety during times of adversity. And although it is true, yes, that this does retell the stories of heroes of faith who were loyal when great powers were threatening their existence, it also speaks to us about this idea here. How do you maintain faithfulness on foreign soil when you're away from a physical temple that has for you been the very house of God, the embodiment of God's presence on earth? How do you do that? How do you continue a faithful walk with God when there is no such thing as a temple? So that's one such thing we'll be looking at as far as the principle is concerned. Because we are we not, as Christians, in a foreign land today? How do we maintain faithfulness to God then? Now, very easy, if you ever look at the book of Daniel, you understand this can easily be seen as two books in one book. The first half of the book is basically how the Jews lived and reacted in a Gentile pagan royal court in chapters 1 through 6. But the second half of the book is chapters 7 through 12, when it talks about the future conflict of good and evil is resolved when God comes on the scene and guarantees that God's people will be able to see these determinable kind of periods of history, recognizing that the promise of God will be fulfilled at the end of those events. Now, there are, and this is just a side note, there are two languages of this book. There is the Hebrew in chapter 1 verses 1 through 2, and chapter 8 verses 12 through 13, as well as Aramaic in chapter 2 verse 4 on down through chapter 7 verse number 28. But the underlying idea of the book is a Jew in a foreign land, his foreignness, and his alienation from what we might call a connectivity or a connection to the social construct of that day. And how would a Jew of the Old Testament in Jerusalem be when he's taken into Babylonian captivity? How would he interrelate with the people of his surrounding area? Now, the two parts of this book, chapters 1 through 6, chapters 7 through 12, do interlink because they tell of the same person and they tell of the same problem. And that problem, again, is how to be God's people under a foreign rule. Now, you're going to notice there are some kind of parallels in the structure of the book. Whether you pick that up or not, you will after this. In chapter 2 and chapter 7, we find it contains visions of the divine kingdom, not of a limited physical kingdom on this earth, but a spiritual divine kingdom that only God is able to provide. Chapter 3 through chapter 6, kind of working our way back, talks about the potential for there being martyrs for God, even in the Old Testament. Martyrdom was not something that was at least a foreign concept by the time you come to Daniel. Then you come a little further. Chapter 4 and chapter 5 exposes the kind of arrogance of the kings of that day and time. And we see that with not only Babylon to a degree, but we also see that with Xerxes or with the Persians in the future. But then chapter 7 becomes a kind of bridge for both parts of that book through the remainder of that book. Now this is called, by the way, in case you are a student or want to learn more, this is called a ring structure in the book. Now Daniel itself covers several centuries of material. Although it's written within Daniel's lifetime, this does cover in prophecy several hundred years. Babylon, kingdom or empire in the 500s, Alexander the Great and the Greek rule of the 300s, and then it also depicts, in my opinion, the Jewish revolt of the 168 BCs. So now, regardless, however, of all the time period and discussion we're talking about right now, the major issues remain the same. Now, what are the issues? The major issues of this book, beyond Daniel in the lion's den, beyond Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, beyond that, you have major issue number 1. How is life in the court for a Jew who is surrounded by a non-Jewish pagan environment? Okay? Life in the court means that, number 1, a Jew would try to be faithful to God, and at the very same time, be loyal to the king. Okay? The loyalty to the king meant a lion's den for Daniel when his faith to God supersedes his physical surroundings. Okay? Now, this echoes a theme of Jewish literature during the Second Temple period. Because you'll remember, what we're seeing here is the foolishness of kings who would be so arrogant as to believe that their temporary place on earth grants them the authority to overpower or supersede, again, circumvent the authority of God. Now remember Ahasuerus back in Esther's day. That's another aspect of this during this temple, Second Temple period. The Jews take a very dim view of Gentile royalty, and we see that in this book to a degree. Maybe not so much with Nebuchadnezzar, but we do with those who follow. So, if we're going to parallel this period of Old Testament history to Greek texts, they also portray Persian kings as basically being drunken tyrants. But as far as faithfulness in life in the court, faithful people can survive a system of dominance when they pray. Watch this now. When they pray, when they maintain certain food law propriety, when they avoid idolatry, and when there is injustice, a good Jew can excel even in a pagan court or a court of the Gentiles. Now, when a person is successful in a foreign land, don't you think that's a sign that God is protecting his chosen people? And that is, of course, affirmative. If God's people are faithful in a foreign land away from the temple, and they find success, then God is blessing them even outside the temple confines. Okay? Now, the part 2, with chapters 7 through 12, you kind of get a different picture because now events turn darker. Jews cannot survive under these present conditions of the empire anymore, whether it's Babylonian or Persian. So God is going to intervene. God is going to come down. He's going to fix the problems by presenting an eternal kingdom. Now, by the 2nd century before Christ, the Jews will be under a lot of increasing pressure to conform to a Hellenistic way of life. And that's the massive social shift here that's going to test the dedication of God's people. It's one thing to be in a foreign land and have a foreign dictatorship or a foreign rulership tell you how you must be while you're in their land. But it's something else when you return home and a foreign rule comes where you are and tells you how to live. So that massive social shift is going to test God's people. So the real hero of the book is who? You might say Daniel. You might say Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but you would be wrong. The real hero of the story here is God. Because God's words of judgment and God's words of hope, they're the things that are inspiring the reader to remember the powers over them will not always remain. And there's a time of triumph that can be hoped for throughout the times of darkness they're surrounded by. So, as far as heroes, God is the hero. However, there's manifestations of God's heroship presence in the lifestyle of men like Daniel and the 3 who have to make tough decisions about how to live faithfully in a foreign land. Now, this would inspire other people who are also there or back, eventually back home, who would also be dealing with the very same situations. So we could apply the idea of that principle to our own life today. How will we How will we dedicate our walk of faith in the year 2012 when we are surrounded by people who do not know God? Now, as we kind of start to wind this down now, visions of part 2, 7 through 12, do not describe a future so far that they have no relevance in the Jewish mindset of that day and time. I want you to understand that. Okay? In just several generations, they have to prepare for what's going to be a faith test, a fight of survival of their faith and for their own people. These are not history accounts. They're offerings of hope for the people of God. Now, Daniel gives to us a visionary language so that future prophets could interpret events of their own time. I think we see that especially with John. Daniel provides a foundation upon which John provides the revelation for us by interpreting the Roman Empire, utilizing the same language that Daniel used back here. So I think the structure is the same. I think the contexts and the histories are different. And that's a very important aspect to those who would take Revelation and key it into Daniel, acting as though those concepts are one and the same, and that they can be used in a kind of futurist interpretation sense. Okay? Anytime religious people live under distress, there's a language that helps to give hope and trust in God. And Daniel does that in his context. John does that in their context. Although there are differing historical events, there are at least parallels regarding that concept. Now, as far as overview for what you should study the life in the court for Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego in chapters 1 through chapter 6. Study the visions of the future in chapters 7 through 12. And then look at the final vision in particular in chapter 10 through 12. And that will provide you a kind of basis for theological reflection and application. When you study God's Word in this way, what you do is you help to create an environment wherein your Christianity in the year 2012 by principle is relevant. Until next time, may God bless you.